2017, a shipping container arrives at the port of Los Angeles. Customs officials scan it. 18 tons of avocados from Michoacán, all properly documented, all destined for Whole Foods. They wave it through. 3 days later, DEA agents in Chicago arrest a mid-level distributor for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. In his ledger, they find a curious entry. Avocado shipment, $240K profit. But there were no drugs in that container. No hidden compartments, just avocados. The agents are confused until a forensic accountant explains the cartel didn't hide drugs in the shipment. They owned the shipment. The entire supply chain from tree to truck to port was theirs. The avocados weren't a cover. They were the business. This is the story of how one of the world's most violent criminal organizations seized control of a fruit. To understand how cartels conquered the avocado trade, you need to understand a simple geographical fact. There is only one place on Earth that can feed America's insatiable appetite for guacamole: Michoacán, Mexico. This single state, roughly the size of West Virginia, produces approximately 80% of all avocados imported into the United States. In 2022, that meant over $3 billion in annual trade. The concentration is not accidental. Michoacán's volcanic soil, temperate climate, and elevation create perfect growing conditions. For decades, this monopoly was merely an agricultural curiosity. Then, in the early 2010s, it became something else, a vulnerability. The timing was catastrophic. Just as Mexican drug cartels were facing unprecedented pressure, military crackdowns, extradition treaties, the fracturing of old alliances, American consumers discovered avocados. The numbers are staggering. In 2000, the average American ate 2 pounds of avocados per year. By 2020, that figure had jumped to 8 pounds. The Super Bowl alone now requires 140 million avocados to satisfy game day guacamole demand. Millennial food culture, Instagram aesthetics, the rise of health-conscious eating, all of it converged on a single crop, grown in a single region, controlled by thousands of small farmers who had no way to defend themselves. This is where the Knights Templar entered the story. By 2011, the cartel, a splinter group that had broken away from La Familia Michoacana, was in crisis. Their leader, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, known as El Mas Loco, had been killed in a shootout with federal forces. The cartel's methamphetamine operations were under siege. They needed a new revenue stream, something that could generate consistent cash flow without the volatility of the drug trade. They found it growing on trees. The initial model was simple: extortion. Cartel operatives would arrive at an orchard, usually in pairs, sometimes alone. They'd speak to the owner. The conversation was brief. You pay a fee, cobro de piso they called it, a floor tax, for the privilege of operating on their territory. The fee was calculated per hectare, typically between 5,000 and 15,000 pesos per month, depending on the farm's productivity. Refusal was not complicated. Your workers would be threatened, your trucks would be hijacked, your packing facility would burn, or you would simply disappear. One farmer, we'll call him Rodrigo, later described his first encounter with Templar enforcers in 2012. He owned 20 hectares outside Uruapan, Michoacán's avocado capital. 2 men arrived in a white pickup. They didn't display weapons, but Rodrigo knew they were armed. They told him the fee, 10,000 pesos per month. Rodrigo did the math. His monthly profit margin was already thin. Avocados are labor-intensive, vulnerable to disease, subject to price fluctuations. The cartel was demanding nearly 30% of his net income. He asked what the money was for. Protection, they said. From whom? From us, they didn't need to say. Rodrigo paid, so did his neighbors. Within 18 months, intelligence analysts estimate the Knights Templar were extracting between $50 and $100 million annually from Michoacán's avocado industry through extortion alone. But extortion, the cartel soon realized, was inefficient. It required constant enforcement, created resentment, and left the actual business in the hands of farmers who might cooperate with authorities. The Templars began to evolve their approach. Instead of taxing the industry, they would own it. The vertical integration began quietly. Cartel-linked buyers would approach struggling farmers, men drowning in debt, facing crop failures, or simply exhausted by years of extortion payments. The offer was straightforward: sell your land at a fair price and walk away. Some farmers took the deal gratefully, others refused and found their circumstances worsening. Trucks stolen, shipments lost, workers intimidated, until selling seemed like the only option. By 2013, intelligence reports suggested the Knights Templar controlled hundreds of avocado orchards outright, operating them through front companies and intermediaries. But land ownership was only the beginning. The cartel understood that the real choke points in the avocado trade were infrastructure and logistics. They began acquiring packing facilities, the warehouses where avocados are washed, sorted, and prepared for export. These facilities are critical. Without certification from a packing house, avocados cannot legally enter the United States. The cartels didn't just seize these facilities, they professionalized them. They hired legitimate managers, maintained proper documentation, ensured quality control. To outside observers, these were legal businesses operating within the regulatory framework. The only difference was who received the profits. The transportation networks were next. Avocados must move quickly from orchard to packing facility to refrigerated truck to port or border crossing. Any delay means spoilage. The cartels infiltrated trucking companies sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through investment. They placed their own people in logistics firms, ensuring that cartel-owned avocados received priority, that competitors faced delays, and that shipments crossing into the United States had the right paperwork. One investigator later described it as a shadow supply chain, running parallel to the legitimate industry but indistinguishable from it. The money laundering elegance was undeniable. Drug trafficking generates enormous cash profits, but that cash must be cleaned, integrated into the financial system without attracting attention. Avocados provided the perfect vehicle. A cartel could take $1 million in methamphetamine proceeds, purchase an orchard or packing facility, and suddenly that money was legitimate business income. The farm produces real avocados, generates real revenue, pays real taxes. The criminal origin of the capital is obscured beneath layers of agricultural commerce. And because the avocado trade operates at such scale, billions of dollars, thousands of transactions, individual cartel operations disappeared into the noise. By 2013, the situation in Michoacán had become untenable. Farmers were being extorted, disappeared, or forced off their land. Local police were either compromised or terrified. State and federal forces were overwhelmed or complicit. Into this vacuum stepped a movement that would briefly capture international attention: the autodefensas, or self-defense militias. It began in the town of Tancítaro, Michoacán's avocado heartland. A group of farmers, small business owners, and ordinary citizens decided they'd had enough. They armed themselves, initially with hunting rifles and shotguns, later with weapons seized from cartel members, and began patrolling their communities. The movement spread rapidly. By early 2014, thousands of militia members were operating across Michoacán, setting up checkpoints, expelling cartel operatives, and in some cases, engaging in open combat with Templar forces. The face of the autodefensa movement was Dr. José Manuel Mireles, a physician from the towns of Tepalcatepec. Mireles articulated a simple argument. The Mexican government had failed to protect its citizens, so citizens had the right to protect themselves. The militias achieved remarkable initial success. In Tancítaro, they drove out the Knights Templar entirely, established civilian patrols, and restored a degree of normalcy. Avocado production actually increased. Farmers who had fled returned to their orchards. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that grassroots resistance could succeed where the state had failed. But the autodefensa movement contained the seeds of its own collapse. The Mexican government, alarmed by armed civilians operating outside state control, moved to co-opt the militias. Authorities offered to formalize the autodefensas, transforming them into official rural police forces under government oversight. Some militia leaders accepted, eager for legitimacy and resources. Others refused, suspicious of government intentions. The movement fractured. Mireles himself was arrested in 2014 on weapons charges many observers saw as politically motivated. And in some areas, the militias became what they had originally fought against. Former autodefensa members, now armed and organized, began engaging in extortion, land seizures, and alliances with rival cartels. The line between resistance and criminality blurred, then disappeared. As the autodefenses fragmented, a new power was rising in Michoacán, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. CJNG, as it's known, had emerged in the early 2010s as one of Mexico's most sophisticated and violent criminal organizations. Unlike the Knights Templar, which had begun as a pseudo-religious social movement before descending into criminality, CJNG operated like a corporation. It had a clear hierarchy, specialized divisions, and a ruthless approach to competition. When CJNG moved into Michoacán around 2015, it wasn't just seeking to extort the avocado industry, it intended to dominate it. The turf war was catastrophic. Between 2015 and 2020, Michoacán became one of the most violent states in Mexico, with homicide rates spiking as CJNG clashed with remnants of the Templars, splinter factions, and local autodefensa groups that had transformed into criminal gangs. Avocado orchards became battlegrounds. In some cases, cartels burned competitors' groves, destroying millions of dollars in crops to assert territorial control. The violence wasn't abstract. It was farmers executed at checkpoints. Packing facility managers disappeared, entire families fleeing their land. The avocado trade continued. Demand was too high, the economics too compelling, but it operated under a shadow of fear. CJNG's approach to the avocado industry reflected its broader sophistication. Rather than relying solely on violence and intimidation, the cartel integrated itself into the industry's institutional structure. They cultivated relationships with local officials, ensuring that permits and certifications flowed smoothly for cartel-linked operations. They invested in technology, using GPS tracking and encrypted communications to manage logistics, and critically, they targeted the inspectors. The United States Department of Agriculture maintains a significant presence in Michoacán. USDA inspectors are responsible for certifying that avocados meet phytosanitary standards before export. These inspectors are the final gatekeepers. Without their approval, no avocados cross the border legally. The cartels understood that intimidating or corrupting these inspectors was essential to maintaining their control over the trade. The threats were often subtle, anonymous messages, surveillance that made clear the inspectors' movements were being tracked, or warnings delivered through intermediaries. Most inspectors continued their work, but the psychological pressure was immense. They were operating in a region where cartels had demonstrated their willingness to kill officials, journalists, and civilians with impunity. On February 11, 2022, the pressure broke into public view. A USDA inspector in Uruapan received a direct threat on his personal cell phone. The message was explicit: "Stop conducting inspections, or you will be killed." The inspector reported the threat to U.S. authorities. Within hours, the United States ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar, made an extraordinary decision: suspend all avocado imports from Michoacán indefinitely. The economic impact was immediate. Michoacán ships roughly 135,000 tons of avocados to the United States every month. The suspension, though it lasted only a week, sent shockwaves through the industry. Avocado prices in the United States spiked. Mexican producers faced potential losses in the hundreds of millions. The Mexican government scrambled to provide assurances, increasing security around USDA personnel and promising a crackdown on cartel intimidation. The suspension was lifted on February 18th, but the incident had revealed an uncomfortable truth. The cartel penetration of the avocado industry was so deep that it could threaten the entire U.S.-Mexico agricultural relationship. What makes the avocado situation uniquely intractable is that the cartels are not external parasites. They are embedded within the industry itself. A farmer in Michoacán today operates in an environment where cartel presence is a given. He may pay extortion fees. He may sell his avocados through a cartel-controlled packing facility without knowing it. He may employ workers who have cartel connections. The lines are not clear, and for many participants in the industry, there is no realistic alternative. Michoacán's economy is built on avocados. Families depend on the income. Communities survive because of the trade. The consumer in Los Angeles or New York or Chicago is completely insulated from this reality. The avocado arrives at the supermarket perfectly ripe, reasonably priced. There is no label indicating that a portion of the supply chain might be controlled by the Jalisco New Generation cartel. There is no warning that the farmer who grew this fruit may have been extorted, threatened, or forced to sell his land. The violence is sanitized away by distance, by logistics, by the sheer scale of global commerce. Efforts to combat cartel control have been sporadic and largely ineffective. The Mexican government has deployed additional security forces to Michoacán, but corruption and violence persist. Some producers have attempted to create cartel-free certification programs, but enforcement is nearly impossible. The United States has limited leverage. Suspending imports punishes Mexican farmers and disrupts American consumers, but does little to dislodge cartel influence. And the fundamental problem remains: as long as there is enormous demand for a product that can only be grown in one concentrated region, whoever controls that region controls the trade. The story of cartels and avocados is not an anomaly. It is a case study in how organized crime adapts, how legal industries become criminal enterprises, and how global supply chains can obscure violence. The same dynamics that allowed cartels to seize the avocado trade are present in other industries: lime production, logging, mining, fishing. Wherever there is concentrated geography, high demand, and weak governance, there is opportunity for criminal control. The human cost is measured in thousands of lives disrupted, displaced, or ended. Farmers who lost their land, workers who disappeared, families who fled Michoacán entirely, abandoning the orchards their grandparents planted. The avocado industry continues to grow, continues to generate billions in revenue, continues to supply American consumers with the fruit they demand. But that growth is built, in part, on a foundation of violence that most consumers will never see. What does it say about the global drug war that cartels have found more profit and arguably more sustainability in a legal agricultural product than in narcotics?